I'm used to giving this presentation to technically oriented people, and I understand that most of you are from support areas and not engineering. But if you follow along closely, I'm sure you'll be able to understand the engineering detail.
Looks like I'm going to do some traveling in the next couple of weeks. The boss asked me to prepare that piece for the customer once again.
Which units of the customer organization are going to be there?
Oh, it really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. I'll give it to whoever shows up.
I just wondered if it was going to be the technical group or the management group.
The review's the same in any case. Look, I know what we want to emphasize. Last time we went out, we did a wonderful job in the procurement problem, and that's what I'm going to hit them hard on. I'm real proud of that.
I understand the presentation to the customer went badly. What happened?
I don't want to talk about it.
Nobody wants to talk about it. Listen, I've got to make a presentation to them next week. What shall I prepare for?
We can prepare for a disaster. They're going to chew you apart just the way they did us. Look, I think the best thing to do is just forget this fiasco ever happened and start all over.
Now, what you just saw was a good example of some of the attitudes that people have about audiences. If you're not willing to spend the time ahead of time to understand the direct nature of that audience, that is, to do an audience analysis, you're very likely to run into serious kinds of problems where what you're going to say does not relate to what they want to hear. So far, we've been talking about the kind of general characteristics that you might consider when you're looking at an audience. But I think it's more important now to shift our attention and start talking about how do you, as an individual, make an audience analysis that will better enable you to get your point across, that is, to make a better technical presentation. And I guess the easiest way to look at audience analysis is to understand that it really takes place in three different contexts, literally before the presentation, during the presentation, and after the presentation. Because it's those three times when you have the best capability of understanding how well your audience is relating to what you're doing. An obvious place to begin is, of course, what do you do before you speak to the audience? I think when you talk about audience analysis beforehand, I think the serious question you ask is, what is the audience purpose, number one? Literally, why are they there listening to what you're saying? I think an interesting distinction can be made if you look at an analysis that was made by Kepner and Trago, and they talked in terms of how to do problem solving. They made a distinction between what someone needs or must have as opposed to what someone wants. And I think the difference between need and want is a critical one. When you think in terms of why is the audience there, your first point is, all right, what is it that they have to have? And a need literally is a non-negotiable item. I'll give you an example. If you're buying an automobile, for instance, you know what your needs are. You need to get from one place to another. You need n number of seats if you have a lot of people that you have to go with. You need certain things, and you can list those very carefully. But you know, when you look at it, almost every automobile on the market is going to meet your needs. When we start to negotiate, when we start to go out to look at various automobiles and so on and so forth, we start talking literally about wants. Wants are such things as color, size, the features that are on the automobile, all kinds of other things of that nature. They're not necessarily critical. Now, the same thing is true with the audience. There are some elements of their purpose in being there that frankly are not negotiable. There are some elements, however, where you have to have a sense of what it is they really want to find out about. And that can vary considerably, by the way, from audience to audience and from day to day and week to week, month to month, if you're continuing with the same audience. These things keep changing, but they're not all that difficult to find. All you have to do is to recognize that it is part of your communication effort to sit down ahead of time and ask yourself the question, why are they listening? That is, what do they need? And then ask, what do they want out of this? What are the kinds of variables or negotiable items that are important to them? Now, a second element of definition or analysis of the audience is to look at what is the audience's role in terms of the corporate kind of interrelationships that are associated with a technical presentation. Now, earlier we talked about role being described in reference to job as opposed to personality. I think it's the same thing here. When an individual is present in an audience in a technical presentation, they are probably identifiable in the same kind of organization chart that we talked about earlier. That is now, however, the customers, or if you will, the audience's org chart. What function do they perform that makes them a part of the audience? Because that function is important for you. Certainly the functions are going to impose such things as what standards does that individual operate by. The more you know about the kinds of standards a member of the audience has as a function of their role, the easier it is to express your message in ways that will appeal to them. I think you need to understand something of the problems that the audience is facing at any given time. I don't mean the immediate engineering problem that they're dealing with, but what about tangential kinds of problems? Problems associated with what's going on in their own company, what's going on with outsiders impacting on the company, if there are cost problems associated with schedule problems, whatever they might be. Understand where that person is in reference to their role. And finally, I think it's important to understand something about the audience's values. And values, I think, are identified somewhat by the job situation that a person is in. One might place higher value, for instance, on engineering function than they place, for instance, on environmental considerations in one audience, but in another that might reverse. So when we talk about the role of the audience, take a look at what function they perform, what standards they perform by, what their problems might be, and what values they might bring as a nature of the function that they perform. Now, there's another element that you can look at, and that is audience level. Now, again, be careful. I'm not talking now about org chart levels. I'm talking about levels of technical knowledge. When you go into any kind of a presentation, as we discussed earlier, you're going to have audiences who have a familiarity with the subject matter that ranks from very familiar down to not very familiar at all. And when you talk about technical knowledge, recognize that you've got to get a little bit of a feel for the general overall technical knowledge of the people that make up the audience. Now, that technical knowledge is also expressed, by the way, on the basis of their experience. That is, their experience with the subject matter, their experiences they've had, for instance, with other representatives of your company, other people representing your discipline. What kind of background are they likely to have? And if you're in a situation where you have an ongoing dialogue or ongoing opportunity to relate to a particular audience, then what past experiences have they had with you as an individual? How well do they know you? How well, for instance, are they familiar with the way you handle information, with your responsibilities, the way in which your kind of expertise impacts on them? And I think a final thing that you need to look at before you reach the audience, I guess what will only be called the uniqueness of some audiences. Now, uniqueness is kind of hard to get at, but for instance, let's talk about sensitivities that an audience might have. Some audiences at one time or another may be very, very sensitive about certain technical areas. I recall once an individual making a presentation in which he was kind of comparing the use of barometric altimeters to radar altimeters. And the organization to whom he was making the presentation represented an airline. And obviously they're interested in this sort of thing. But he had to be very cautious about talking about such things as running into large obstacles like mountains, if for no other reason than the fact that that particular airline had just lost an airplane with all on board by running into a mountain. Now, at that point, you walk very cautiously when you talk about it. Remember we talked about trigger words? The tendency of an audience to become so emotionally involved in what is being said that they don't listen anymore. That's the kind of thing you need to be aware of when we talk about audience sensitivities. There's also such a thing as audience tendencies on an individual basis. Now, let me give you an example. If you have a continuing relationship with an audience, and you know that every time you're going to make a technical presentation, some of the same people are going to be there. Some of these people are key people in terms of whether or not you get your point across. What are the tendencies of these key people? That is, are they, for instance, challengers? You know, there are people who have that tendency. They get in an audience situation, and no matter what you say, whether they may agree with you, by the way, but they still want to challenge you a little bit, a little push going on. You have some people who have a tendency to be nitpickers, all right? They want to get into the nitty-gritty down at the lowest possible level and pick apart things that are going on. I think if you know that, that's critical. You may have some people in an audience situation on a continuous basis, no matter what you say, they're going to come back and say, that sounds good to me, but what is it going to cost? They're the costers. They're the people who are concerned with the price tag that's on everything. Now, if you know that in advance, this is the critical thing, you can then prepare yourself better for making the technical presentation. Now, analysis beforehand, I think, leads to one end result. I think it's important that before you go anywhere or before you do anything to make a technical presentation, you ought to be able to do an analysis that allows you to literally come up with a profile of your audience, so that before you start doing anything else, you can say, all right, here are the general characteristics of this specific audience. They have these tendencies, they have this level, they have this kind of background and experience, this is the reason for being there, that you have covered it in detail. Now, there's a lot more, however, to analyzing an audience than just what you do ahead of time. There's a lot of analysis that's associated with what you do during the presentation. That is the analysis that's going on while you're standing up and they're sitting down in their chairs. If you recall earlier, we were talking about the concept of feedback. That is, there's communication going both directions when you're making a presentation, obviously from the speaker to the audience. But there's an awful lot of communication going from the audience to the speaker, and that's what you've got to be attuned to when we talk about audience analysis during the presentation. I think it begins, first of all, by what we call a very simple concept of being aware of what's going on. Look, this, if nothing else, by the way, implies that occasionally you've got to be looking at the audience. This is something we'll talk about more later on. But awareness begins when you actually eyeball your audience, because that's when you begin to get at least half of the information. See, there are two kinds of clues that you get from an audience about what's going on: the nonverbal and the verbal cues. Let me talk about nonverbal communication just briefly here. If you stand in front of an audience and look at them, eyeball to eyeball, in the process of making a presentation, one of the first kinds of information you're going to get is what's going on in the facial expressions. Now, we've got a tremendous number of muscles, by the way, in the human face that control our facial expression. And the audience, in many cases, is not going to have them under control at all times, so that their attitudes, their emotions, their reactions to what you're saying are going to be reflected in the way they look at you. Now, if you're looking out at an audience and they're all giving you a kind of a nice involved, look, that's pretty good information. They're all sitting there like this. That's information, isn't it? And if you say something, and about half the audience goes, how many words do you need for something like that? And I don't want to get into too much detail on this facial expression thing, because we can split it out in my discipline into little details like the eyebrows and what's going around the mouth and everything like that. I don't think that's necessary. Human beings, by their very nature, learn very, very early to read other people. That is, to read their facial expressions. It's literally a part of our whole maturation in the area of communication. You're all skilled at this, by the way. In a conversation, you pick up facial cues constantly and adjust and react to them. So all I'm saying here is, don't eliminate that kind of skill just because you're standing up in front of an audience. keep looking at them, watch what their faces are doing. It's going to give you information frequently about whether you're getting across or not. There's another element that's associated with the nonverbal, and that's the eyes. We talk about eyeball-to-eyeball communication. And you know very well that when you sit and talk to someone, all right, just two people, you like to have them looking at you, and you like to look at them. Now, if you run into a situation where the audience starts to break eye contact frequently, they're anywhere, they're looking around, and they look everywhere except at you, then that's a pretty good clue that they're not involved. They're not relating to what you're saying. It's always a good clue, I think, when about half the audience starts this routine. All right? It may be sleep, and it may not be sleep. It may really mean that they have chosen to tune out at this point, and they're no longer looking at you. Now, we'll talk about looking at visuals later on, and there are times, obviously, when their attention is going to be focused on something they ought to be seeing. But in general, when you're talking to them, if you're looking at them, I think it's reasonable to expect that they'll be looking back at you. And if you see a loss in eye contact, then I think that's some kind of information you need to be aware of. Now, there's a third element of nonverbal communication that you need to be aware of, and that's the body itself. Now, if you are making a presentation and the audience is sitting around a table, all right, like this, you get times when you can obviously see people lean forward. Now, that's a pretty good clue, by the way, that they're literally leaning into the message and getting involved. Now, if at some point somebody kind of pulls back and does this number on you, now you know that there's a tendency to at least suggest that they're now taking a defensive position, and didn't like that comment at all. You get people who will start taking notes, and again, the combination of covering the eyes and doing something else entirely. This is all information. We get information even about the way people sit. People who pull back from the table during a presentation, cross their legs. That means they're kind of relaxed. They're certainly not being threatened or intimidated by anything that's going on. Kind of cool, all right? You get people who sit like this. Well, that's a less comfortable posture, and most people don't sit in this semi-military sit-at-attention style. Of course, people can really flake off on you, and if they go too far, you may suspect ultimately that they're about to go to sleep. Now, again, the same thing that we talked about for facial expression applies to body language. It applies to the use of the hands and everything. Every once in a while, you're going to run into circumstances where a pattern of nonverbal communication is somewhat individual. That is, one member of the audience may be doing something that indicates they're not with you as a person. Don't look for individual responses. It's kind of an overall pattern. I don't think there's any kind of specific profile that's associated with it or anything else. Just be alert to what's going on. You are as skilled and adept at reading nonverbal messages as is anybody else. We do it constantly. All I want to say is don't stop doing it merely because you're standing at a podium talking to an audience in a kind of a formal presentational style. Now, there are some verbal things too, by the way. I said there was both nonverbal and verbal. Not only do we talk about what people say specifically, that we'll deal with that when we talk about questions themselves, but the tone of voice that an individual uses is very much what we call a nonverbal cue. There's a difference, for instance, if someone says, what is that research based on? All right, that's one question, isn't it? Another question is, what is that research based on? Now, see, there's the tone of voice is very, very different in each case. Same words, but a very different message that you hear. So it's not just the words alone. Kind of listen between the lines and be able to pick up certainly some of the attitudinal clues that are coming at you based on what the audience is feeling or thinking. Now, that's the awareness part of what you do during a presentation. There's a second element, however, associated with audience analysis or audience relationship during a presentation. And I think it's important that you understand that also. It's called direct communication. Now, let me try to explain that. You could use the term honest, sincere, straightforward, level. There are all kinds of terms that you can use. But direct communication is a kind of an attitude that we have that says to the audience, you and I are involved in a communication interrelationship. It's very simple. You have a responsibility to deal with them. They have a responsibility to deal with you. It's an interconnected sort of thing. What happens then when you run into a situation where you have a negative attitude? All right, it's up here in your head. I think you need to be aware of the fact that you're likely to generate a negative attitude on the part of the audience. If you don't want to be there, if you're uncomfortable in the circumstance, you feel that you're really being put on to have to make the presentation to start with, be careful, because that attitude is going to be communicated. Now, if you try to cover it up, by the way, so you're going to hide it, you're going to smile a lot during the presentation, it is not going to work, by the way. The same kind of nonverbal feedback that we were talking about earlier is built right into what you're doing. And if you've got some reason why you feel something is critical, important, whatever your attitude might be, put it right out in front. Deal honestly with an audience. Don't play games with them. What do you do, for instance, when you're standing up there, you're dealing with technical information, and you make a mistake? All right? Let's just talk about, or at least demonstrate, the difference between handling a mistake well and handling a mistake badly.
Our analysis indicates that the front-end engineering cost will be about 21%. On-site engineering costs about 35%. The home office and support costs about 18%. And the materials and the equipment about 36%. Now, these figures now are
say, excuse me, that's 110%.
I guess it is, isn't it? I'm afraid probably one of those numbers is wrong. I don't think the numbers themselves are critical. It does give you the on-site engineering about 35% of the total, the home office and support about 18%, materials and equipment about 36%. Now these figures are based on...
excuse me, that's 110%.
You're right, as a matter of fact, it is 110%. I guess that's what I get for hiring my brother-in-law. I'm sure that one of the figures has been transposed inaccurately, and I would like to be absolutely sure that we have the right numbers. And I think what we better do is let's hold this for the moment, and during the break, I'm going to have an opportunity to check the figures, and I'll come back and find out which one of those is incorrect.
Now look, when you get into a mistake situation, you can see the difference there. One individual falls apart in front of the audience, and the other one handles it, I made a mistake. Now, nobody is asking you at any time to turn in a perfect performance. As a matter of fact, we're not talking about performing when we talk about making a technical presentation. Performance belongs to professionals, who make large amounts of money to stand up there and make no errors whatsoever except those that are designed in. You're doing a job, you're presenting technical information. I don't care how good you are, once in a while, you're going to make a mistake. Now, I'll give you an example, by the way, of how big a mistake you can make. I was doing a series of seminars on, literally, on effective technical presentations. They were all done live, all done in Southern California, almost exclusively with aerospace industries. And this was several years back, by the way. And one of the companies that was helping me set up this kind of a schedule called me and said they wanted me to make a presentation up in Northern California to another company. Well, I didn't bother to ask who the other company was. I merely asked, where is it, how do I get there, and I'll do my shtick. And so I went up to this other company and I got there. The first thing I discovered as soon as I started the presentation is that this company was not in the aerospace business. Their business was the manufacture of birth control pills. Now look, you use a term even like reliability, you're in a whole new ball game, all right? Well, I began to make my presentation, and frankly, it went very badly. You talk about nonverbal feedback. I knew within a very short span of time that I was not getting across. Finally, I reached the point where I had to stop. Say, look, something's not going well here, and for some reason or other, I think I have made a mistake. Tell me more of why I've made the mistake. And they finally came back and they admitted that they were not interested in information on how to give a technical presentation. As a matter of fact, they didn't give technical presentations. Their problem was a very simple one. Every Thursday morning, there was this big humongous meeting that was so critical that most of Wednesday was spent in meetings to get ready for Thursday morning, and most of Tuesday was spent getting ready for meetings on Wednesday to get ready for the Thursday meeting, and Friday they spent most of their day holding meetings that were kind of post-mortems of the Thursday morning meeting. They only worked on Mondays. All right, now, they wanted to know how to be more effective at running a meeting, and I just did not know that. I had not bothered to ask. It was my mistake. How do you handle that? My response was very simple. I said, look, why don't you let me eat lunch alone? That was not a problem, by the way. But during the lunch break of an hour, I sat down and literally designed an afternoon session on how to run meetings. Now, look, the afternoon sessions, they were not of a quality that I would like. I was not as well prepared as I'd like to be. I didn't have the kind of visuals I wanted to have. But the important thing is the afternoon session met their needs. So if the mistake is made, what choice have you got, really? Or you can sit back. I might have very well at that point have said, look, I don't care what you want. I spent weeks working this presentation up and you're going to hear it. Now, that isn't going to work. When you've made a mistake in analysis, for instance, you've got a different group of people than they told you were going to have. They want to know something other than what you're prepared to give them in detail. Roll with the punch. Now, it even goes to the extent, what happens when you're making a technical presentation? Now, you're supposed to be an expert, obviously. Somebody asked you a question that really, frankly, you weren't prepared for. You didn't expect the question at all. And the answer, the honest answer to the question is, I don't know. That's the answer you give them. I know technical experts of any kind are always reluctant to admit in public that they don't know something about their area of expertise. But we go right back to the very beginning. I said that you have a twofold responsibility. Your first responsibility is to the integrity of the subject matter with which you're dealing. Your second responsibility is to deal with the audience. Look, somebody asks you a question, you don't know the answer, you say, I'm afraid I don't know the answer. Now, it is, I think, important that you follow up a little bit on that and say, but I'll find out and I'll let you know just as soon as I can. But look, be honest with an audience. Don't try to stand on your feet and make up answers as you go along. Leave that for lawyers. You stay on the straightforward engineering level. The right answer is, I don't know, then you deal with them very directly and honestly. All of this, I think, kind of boils down to the fact that when you're making a presentation, as you analyze what is going on during the presentation, it may mean that you have to maintain a certain amount of flexibility. As a matter of fact, there are times I think you need to plan in a little flexibility. So you plan to stay at a certain level of development of a technical topic. It doesn't hurt at all, by the way, to have some backup information so that if they want more detail, you've got it. That's kind of planned flexibility. But whatever happens in a technical presentation, be aware of your audience and be willing to deal directly with that audience. It's going to be the end of the world, by the way, if you have to make some kind of a change during a presentation. If you have to deal with them and say, I'm really not prepared for that, or that isn't what they told me we were going to discuss, whatever it happens to be, make a mistake, admit you've made a mistake, and go on from there. Now, we're going to talk about poise later on, but that's kind of a part of it. For here, recognize you deal honestly and openly with an audience. In the long run, that's the best way to deal with an audience. Now, we talked about what you do before you make a presentation. We've talked about audience analysis during a presentation. Audience analysis also extends to after the presentation. You say, hey, what difference does it make after the presentation's over? It's done, it's done. Now, there are times, I think, when, as an engineer, given the corporate circumstances that you're in, you will make presentations to essentially the same corporate audience over and over and over again. If you're involved in a project, for instance, where you are a subcontractor to a prime, well, you know, you're going to have to go back to that prime over and over and over again. Status reports have to be made. There are any one of a number of circumstances where you're constantly relating to roughly the same audience. This is where the after is important. I maintain that it is critical when you have made a technical presentation to the audience, especially if it's a team presentation, by the way, 4 or 5 people involved in it, that as soon as possible after the presentation is over, you sit down and literally hold a post-mortem. That does not necessarily mean, by the way, that you died in the process of making it, but it merely means you look back and analyze what happened. What do you mean? Analyze? Simple. Ask yourself, in general, what kind of response did you get to your presentation? All right? Talk it up amongst yourselves. Did you think it was positive or negative? If it was positive, where was it positive? Where was it negative? Where did it seem to go well? Where did it seem to go badly? What kinds of questions were asked? I don't mean detail what were the questions, but what kind of questions were they? Did they, for instance, deal with one aspect of the presentation more than another? Were they requests for more detailed information, or were they the kinds of questions that reflected you went into too much detail, more generic types of questions? Take a look and do a kind of a time analysis. If, for instance, you have interruptions during the presentations for questions, try to get a feel for which one of your main ideas tended to consume the most amount of time, because that's a good clue as to where the audience's attention was fixed the most. And finally, there's something called follow-up. Look, in particular, if your organization has a kind of a field rep relationship, or you have sales and marketing people who are out in the physical area dealing with customers over and over again, it doesn't hurt at all to have these people go back, literally ask the audience, did it work for you? What was right with it? What was wrong with it? But even if you have a good working relationship with only one person in that audience, some of you know reasonably well, all right, go back to the person and ask them, how did you think it went? Get some kind of an analysis or feedback. And then your post-mortem, by the way, should be written up, especially if it's a continuing relationship with a customer. It should be filed, so that people who make follow-on presentations can take a look at that information and get a better feel for the audience. That's the kind of raw material that is used in making the analysis beforehand. If you're in a corporate circumstance where you frequently relate to the same customer over and over again, audience analysis should not be a difficult problem. There should be the kind of information about that audience, their needs, their wants, their desires, if you will, in terms of the kinds of concerns they have, their sensitivities. All of these things should be well understood. And you should have an opportunity to go back. Take a look at what other people have done. And there it is. That's the kind of raw material you need and you use. If no other reason, by the way, the follow-up or the post-mortem is critical. Because suppose you had a bad one. I mean, it just didn't go the way you wanted it to go. All right, now go back and find out why. Because if you don't know what went wrong, there's almost no way in which you can correct it in follow-on presentations. Now, you know, when we talk about audience analysis in general, it's kind of interesting that the book I referred to earlier, The Rhetoric by Aristotle, you know, that whole thing is literally an analysis of audiences. From the very beginning, anybody who's interested in better communication is almost inevitably going to begin, not on the basis of what you say or how you say it, but begin on the basis of to whom are you going to communicate the information. You'll notice, by the way, this is the 4th program. And of the 4 programs, we've already spent 3 of them talking about the audience. And I want to reinforce the idea. This is where you begin. When someone says, you're going to make a presentation, this is where you start. Understand the nature of listeners, understand the general characteristics of audiences, and then do an audience analysis ahead of time, do an audience analysis while you're making the presentation, and do your audience analysis after the presentation is over. Now, when you've done all of that, then you're ready for what literally is the second step in the process of building an extemporaneous presentation. And in the next program, we're going to focus our attention on designing the content.